Again, we're transitioning from that discussion of democracy we had to a discussion of journalism, and today we're going to jump into the question of journalism. But I want to make one more comment about contemporary politics. Because it seems to me that when you start critiquing the system in which we live, as we have been doing, you start looking at questions around elite control over political institutions. You start looking at the concentration of wealth and the effect that that concentration of wealth can have on political institutions. One response to that often from people is anger, yes? And anger, it seems to me, is part of politics. You see a lot of anger today in politics in the United States as well as around the world, yes? So I want to just take one last moment before we start talking specifically about journalism and talk a little bit about anger. Okay? To do that, I want to play you a short clip from a movie called Network, which was an Academy Award-winning film in 1976. Has anybody ever seen the film Network? It's a film worth renting and looking at. It is scary in the way that 3 decades before it really got off, the film Network kind of imagined contemporary reality television. So 30 years ago, somebody writing a film sort of had this idea that a culture could become so degraded that people would sit and watch reality TV, yes? Not that, none of us would do that, right? None of us would sit and, we have self-respect. We wouldn't sit around and watch those reality shows, for God's sake. Everybody knows, number one, they're not real. You realize this, yes? Reality television is not real. It's scripted. They get together and they figure out what's going to happen. When you put cameras in people's homes, guess what? That's not real. Would you act the same with a camera in your house as you do normally? Would you say the same things? Would you do the same things? Would you pick your nose as frequently? No, of course you wouldn't. So reality TV isn't even real, and we're smart enough to realize that. We don't succumb to these cheap pleasures, but other people do. But who would have thunk it 30 years ago? So the film Network was very interesting for all sorts of reasons, including the way it saw the direction of television. But the clip I want to play is probably the clip with the most famous phrase that came out of the film Network. And it speaks to people's relationship to politics, especially around this question of anger. So the scene you're going to watch is a character named Howard Beale, who's an aging TV anchor whose ratings have dropped, and he's about to be fired. And when he realizes what's happening, he kind of goes off the deep end. And instead of taking him off the air, because going off the deep end is apparently good for ratings, the network leaves him on the air. And what you're going to see is Howard Beale coming in out of the rain. He's been walking all night trying to figure out what he's going to do. And he goes directly on the air. So take a look at this.
I don't have to tell you things are bad. Everybody knows things are bad. It's a depression. Everybody's out of work or scared of losing their job. The dollar buys a nickel's worth. Banks are going bust. Shopkeepers keep a gun under the counter. Punks are running wild in the street, and there's nobody anywhere who seems to know what to do, and there's no end to it. We know the air is unfit to breathe, and our food is unfit to eat. We sit watching our TVs while some local newscaster tells us that today we had 15 homicides and 63 violent crimes, as if that's the way it's supposed to be. We know things are bad, worse than bad. They're crazy. It's like everything everywhere is going crazy, so we don't go out anymore. We sit in the house, and slowly the world we're living in is getting smaller, and all we say is, please, at least leave us alone in our living rooms. Let me have my toaster and my TV and my steel-belted radios, and I won't say anything. Just leave us alone. Well, I'm not going to leave you alone. I want you to get mad. I don't want you to protest. I don't want you to riot. I don't want you to write to your congressmen because I wouldn't know what to tell you to write. I don't know what to do about the depression and the inflation and the Russians and the crime in the street. All I know is that first, you've got to get mad. You've got to say, I'm a human being. God damn it. My life has value. So, I want you to get up now. I want all of you to get up out of your chairs. I want you to get up right now and go to the window, open it, and stick your head out and yell, "I'm as mad as hell, and I'm not going to take this anymore!"
Anger. Yes, those people are angry. It's kind of scary to listen to that little intro he makes where he talks about what's going wrong in the world. Banks going bust, depression, people out of work. Sounds a lot like today. So Howard Beale in this film is expressing people's anger. And the people who run the network see that people will respond to that. So anger. I want to just take one last moment to think about politics and think about anger and politics, because there is a lot of anger, and one might argue justifiable anger in the world today. Anger at the way institutions work, at the way individuals within those institutions work, the way in which those institutions do not seem to serve the needs of ordinary people. There is anger, and I think the question is not, is there anger or is that anger justified? From my point of view, it is. The question is, what do we do with it? Now, Howard Beale, perhaps with appropriate humility, is saying, I don't know what to do. I don't know what to tell you about what to do. But anger itself is not automatically a fuel for positive politics, for politics that solves problems. What I want to leave you with in this segment on democracy and politics is the question of what do we do with our anger? Because anger is important in politics and in history. I want to offer you one quote. Quote from the famous political organizer Abe Osheroff. How many of you have ever heard of Abe Osheroff? Yeah, nobody. That's okay. You're not alone. Abe Osheroff is not a famous person. This person I met about 10, 12 years ago, and I learned a lot from Abe. Abe was a long-time political organizer. He was a carpenter by trade, made his living as a carpenter, but his entire life was dedicated to being a political organizer and activist. As a citizen, he wasn't a professional politician, he wasn't a professional academic, he wasn't a professional writer. He was a carpenter. But throughout his entire life, he engaged in political organizing and activism because he thought it was his obligation as a citizen. And in talking to Abe, one of the things that he said that really stuck with me is this: history is made by organized anger. He said compassion, empathy, the ability to connect other human beings as human beings is crucial. But that alone, he said, does not move history. History is moved by organized anger. And the key term here is organized. Anger in and of itself does not necessarily lead to a positive politics. Anger that wells up in resistance to, reaction to illegitimate authority, injustice, the unequal distribution of wealth, all of that can take you in different ways. Sometimes it takes people backwards, I would argue. Sometimes anger leads people to believe that there was once this golden age where everything was okay, and if we can just get back there, then everything will be fine. And then there is a politics that looks to the past to reconstruct some glorious past that I would argue is almost always mythical. The past always sort of looks more glorious than it actually was. The good old days, they say, look good because, in fact, they're old, and we've forgotten the negatives of them. Anger can also be channeled to change things for the better when it is organized. Maybe that's what we're seeing in Egypt throughout the Arab world. There's a lot of anger in Egypt, in Tunisia, in Libya, in all the countries you're reading about. And it's being organized. It's not just spontaneous anger. Don't get the idea that a bunch of kids just went down, got on Facebook, then went down to Tahrir Square and decided to have a revolution. It was organized by people who've been working for a long, long time, looking toward a future. In Egypt, they don't seem to be trying to reconstruct the glorious past of Egypt. They're looking toward the future. So, in your own thinking about your own politics and what you want from a democratic system, anger is a reality. Anger is, in fact, a fuel for politics. The question is, what do we do with it? Okay. Something to ponder. The other point I want to make before we move on is that anger alone is not enough to guarantee a positive politics. I want to leave you with one other quote from a fellow roughly contemporary to Abe, but much more famous, John Dewey. John Dewey, one of the great American philosophers from the school of philosophy generally called American pragmatism. John Dewey had an enormous influence in the United States, especially in the early 20th century. On education, he wrote widely about education. And Deweyite reforms in education were important in this country. He was also a social and political philosopher. Wrote about the political system, wrote about morals and ethical theory. Dewey's an important fellow. And Dewey constantly went back and stressed the importance of human communication to democracy. And this quote sums that up. Democracy begins in conversation. That the ability of people within a social political unit to converse, to come together and exchange ideas is crucial. And that, I think, is our jumping off point for discussing journalism. Because what I want to suggest today, that if that anger is going to be channeled in positive directions, we have to remember Dewey's central claim that democracy begins in conversation. And journalism, in some sense, is a vehicle for that cultural conversation. The United States has 300 million people. We can't talk to each other very easily sometimes. We need mediated communication because of the size of the nation. And one of the ways to think about the role of journalism is that journalism is a vehicle for that conversation that is essential to democracy. So let that sort of percolate in the background as we talk throughout the rest of the semester about the role of journalism. That whatever else we say about journalism and journalists and their role in society, democracy, Dewey says, begins in conversation, and journalism can be a vehicle to foster and enhance that conversation.